How on earth do you motivate children? This is a question I get a lot as a psychologist from teachers, but also from parents. And I get it, it can be very frustrating if you prepared a lesson, for example, and you put in so much effort, and finally, when the lesson begins, you realize those children are like stones. They don't react to anything. It is so frustrating. And on the other hand, many parents have the same problem if they practice with their children, and after a very short time, the child says, "No, I don't want to do that. I can't do this. I'm too stupid for that. I hate you." And of course, in the long run, not only the child is frustrated, but also the parents. So therefore, let's take a look at studies from psychology and motivational psychology on how to counter, how to act on this frustration and unwillingness. And the first study today really deals with this frustration of the child when it comes to really difficult tasks. So what should you tell your child when it realizes, well, this task is really difficult, I'm really struggling, and it's really hard for the child to keep going? The scientists could show that when they gave children such difficult tasks with which they were really struggling, it was very helpful to tell them that it is normal to experience difficulties and that this experience of difficulties is just a sign that learning is occurring. So all this struggle, all these difficulties were reframed as something positive. They were reframed as, okay, it's great that you are experiencing this, because this struggle means that actually your brain is working very hard and therefore your learning rate must be really good. And those children who were helped to reframe their difficulties in this way later on really performed better in a reading comprehension test and in a working memory test. So for a short time, you could say, they had become a little bit more intelligent. And probably the reason was that now they spent less cognitive capacity into self-doubts, like, for example, oh, I'm really struggling and therefore I must be really bad. Maybe I'm really not that intelligent. And because of the reframing that having difficulties is not a sign of being dumb or something, but instead it is just a sign that your brain actually is learning something right now. Because of this reframing, they probably has less of these self-destructive thoughts, and therefore they had more capacity to concentrate on the actual task. So whenever your child is struggling with something, if it says, well, this is too hard, I don't want to do it, I hate you, then you can help your child or your children by giving this explanation for the difficulties. And it is really true, you're not telling bullshit. We all know that when we are really struggling and if we feel like, I don't know if I can learn all that, these really were the moments in the past in which we learned the most. And it's really helpful to remind your children, but also yourself of this in order to cultivate this kind of growth mindset. And the cultivation of this growth mindset is also the second strategy, because whenever it is possible, it can be helpful to teach your child or your children, if you are in front of a class, the concept of neuroplasticity, that our brain, the more we use it, the more it changes. I mean, nowadays there are hundreds of studies that could show that, for example, when people use their thumbs in order to control their smartphones, it could be shown that the motoric areas in your brain became larger and larger. The same could be shown, for example, with juggling. If you learn juggling with balls, for example, there will be changes in your brain which can be observed with brain scanners. And there are hundreds of studies like that. And it can be very motivating for children to learn that about their brain, that it is not something that is unchangeable, and that it is at some point it might be full and then it's not possible to learn something else. This is complete bullshit. In this respect, our brain is a little bit paradox. The more you put into it, the more you are able to learn something new. So for example, if you already learned 5 languages, because of all the knowledge about these languages and many vocabularies which are quite similar, you will be able to learn the next language much faster. And this is something for so many areas. The more knowledge you have, the more easy it will become to learn something new. And this is something children should really know. They should be told every day, because studies could show that if you have this kind of growth mindset, if you know that you can grow, then of course people more often choose learning goals in comparison to so-called performance goals. So they choose goals in which they really can learn something new in comparison to goals in which they get the best performance. And to observers, they might look like the best person on earth. So it's like you could say they choose ego goals, and therefore they would also more often than not cheat in a test, for example. But the more they have this growth mindset, they are really interested in learning something new because they think it can help them to grow. So whenever possible, I mean, there are numerous videos on the internet you can show children in which you can see that, for example, new synapses are formed, or how the brain changes when it learns something new. And the more you teach your child that the brain really is like a muscle, and the more you train it, the stronger it will become, this will be really motivating for your child. Another way, and now we come to strategy number 3 to cultivate this kind of growth mindset, is to praise their efforts or their strategies. So, for example, if a child gets a good grade at maths, you don't say, "Wow, you must be so intelligent. Wow, you must be really gifted." Instead, you say, "Wow, you really must have learned very hard. You must have put a lot of effort." Or you could say, "Wow, I just see at task number 5, you found a really creative solution." So you don't praise the person, but instead you praise the effort and the creativity, or you might also praise the concentration. So you might say, "Well, you concentrated really good." And if you praise in this way, you cultivate the growth mindset, because the next time, if there might be a drawback, if there's a disappointment, if there's a bad grade, the next time the child will know, well, if I get a bad grade, I just have to put in more effort. I might have to find other strategies, or maybe I might have to concentrate more. So it's all within my power. What I do, I can change it. But if you praise the child before by saying, "Well, you must be so intelligent, you are so gifted," then it could be shown that in the eye of failure, if the child got a bad grade in maths, then this is something the child cannot change. Because if a good grade means that you are intelligent, then of course a bad grade must mean that you are not intelligent, that you must be dumb, and therefore you can't change it and you give up. So there were really some studies that could show it's much better to praise the effort or the strategy, because later on children will perform better in the long run, especially after a failure, and they will also choose more learning goals. And this is something which is very important in the long run as well, because if you don't choose learning goals, you don't learn that much. The next strategy, the so-called Question-Behaviour-Effect, is something my father used to use very effectively on me when I was still younger and I was playing tennis every day, and I thought I could become extremely good at tennis. But in order to become really good at tennis, you have to practice services. So you have to go on the court alone with a basket of balls, and you should practice services every day for an hour, for example. But being alone on the tennis court really isn't that much fun. So my father had a clever strategy just to ask me, just to put out a question by saying, "Do you plan to practice some services today?" More often than not, I thought, well, actually, I almost had forgotten. So by asking somebody if he is planning to do something, it's like priming him. It's like putting this idea in his head when he almost had forgotten to do so. It's a really clever reminder, and it's really much more friendly than saying, "Well, son, don't forget to practice your services today." No, it's just a very small reminder. And it could be shown in many studies that this question behavior effect really works quite well. You just have to ask something, and more often than not, the behavior will really follow. So for example, if you have a child that is playing a lot of PlayStation and computer and is not going out anymore and hasn't seen any friends for a while, it can be helpful to ask, for example, hey, don't you want to meet with Tim once again? Or if you know that in 2 weeks there will be a very important class test, you could also ask, and did you already begin to learn for the class test? And in this way, you really plant the idea in their brain to, for example, going out again or to learn for the class tests. And it is really more autonomy respecting than saying, well, you have to learn for the class test now. The last strategy that can be very helpful to motivate children is to offer flexible goals. So for example, if you're learning with your child or children, it can be much more motivating to say, well, try to solve 5 to 15 of these mathematical problems. Instead of saying, well, you have to solve exactly 10. And by offering this flexible number, it is much more motivating to begin, because the lower end, just 5 mathematical problems, is much more reachable. And we know from motivational psychology, and you know it yourself, that the hardest problem is always to get started. And by offering this flexible goal, the child will say 5 problems are really possible. So it will really begin, and maybe after the 5th problem, it will see, well, I'm really getting better. Actually, this is even a little bit fun. And maybe it will say, okay, let's do some more. And then there will be 8, 9, maybe 10, and maybe even 15 problems solved. And actually, this is something you can use for yourself, for example. And this is where the strategy was tested first. When it comes to a workout and you set your goal how many push-ups you want to do the next days, it is much better to tell yourself, well, something between 10 and 30, instead of saying, well, it has to be 20 push-ups every day. Because it could be shown that if people set these flexible goals, they will endure much longer. I really hope you found this episode helpful and interesting. And if you want, we will see you next time.